All right, everybody, I have about 10 seconds or so until the attention span of these low IQ Sam Hyde fans runs out. So let me start by saying this. Sam Hyde is borderline mentally retarded. He lost a debate to an airhead who knows nothing about the topics that Sam Hyde chose to bring up. He's been getting clowned on by people ranging from me all the way to people like Destiny.
And in my opinion, I feel like the neo-Nazi stuff is very akin to flat eartherism, to where if you're well versed in it, I don't think an ordinary person should ever be able to win a debate against you.
Can I finish, bro? Go ahead, man. I want to hear it right now. But you don't want to. Video games or something. You know?
Like he's super triggered. It's surface level stuff for the neo-Nazi stuff is, in my opinion, is very hard to argue against. The phenotype is not just the way that you appear, it's the way that you act. In Europe, in Asia, in India, in America, we have our culture. When you import people from other places, they don't just bring their skin color, they bring their culture. It's detrimental to white people, etc. Like there's a whole line of argumentation to go down there. But it feels like Sam isn't able to do that dynamically. He has to just, okay, let me remember my script. This sort of feels like at least.
And so it's natural that when I made a video about it, all the Sam Hyde fans went to my comments crying. Now, most of these comments were just nonsensical ramblings of people who are scrambling to defend their father figure, Sam Hyde. And so most of them I don't really, feel the need to reply to because they got triggered enough from my replies where I was simply reflecting with low effort responses so that I could bait them into engaging more. Which, by the way, thank you. Turns out Sam Hyde fans are actually my biggest fans as well, because that was my most popular video. But I want to spend today's video responding to some of the terrible arguments that were put forth in the comments, as well as some of the defenses of Sam Hyde, because I think that it's a good learning experience. We can examine some of these, far-right notions in more detail, because they truly are terrible arguments. And, part of my mission here is just to expose how laughable the far-right is, because, they can hide behind, humor and tribalism, but the reality is they understand as well as I do that no one can defend these incoherent views that they put forward. That's why none of them, when I offer them to jump into a voice chat, actually will. Because whether it's race realism, ethno-nationalism, or any of these terrible views, none of them can defend them. They repeat what they hear from their father figures like Sam Hyde or Nick Fuentes, and that's that. That's enough for them because they have no epistemological rigor. They have no academic training. They have no social standing that goes beyond, their position as a Walmart greeter, and so they just don't have the intellectual capacity for engagement, and that's fine. But without further ado, let's get into these arguments. I'll put the timestamps at the bottom for the arguments that I am engaging with so that you can skip to them. Okay, so here it is. I've made a document compiling some of the arguments that I'm going to respond to. But I started off just by saying, again, you guys are my biggest fans. One of these comments was made whenever the video had first came out. It said, there's a reason your videos don't surpass 1K views. Dude, get a job, a real job. As though you can't make videos and have a job. Well, thank you, because that video did surpass 1K views. So I guess your criticism was self-obviating. It obviated itself. And now I can continue to make videos because I have passed 1,000 views, which is great. So thank you. And then someone said, bro's first video above 200 views just because he put Sam Hyde in the title. And honestly, I agree with you. You guys are remarkably easy to rage bait. So I probably will continue to do this. Maybe 1-2 times a week I'll make a Sam Hyde video, bring you guys back in until I get monetized from your idiocy. So let's start with the first argument, though. This comes from Praise Sun 680. Shout out to Praise Sun. He says, here in Ireland, we are being ethnically replaced with Indians and Africans in the last 5 years alone. In 2019, by the way, I had to turn off Grammarly just because of how bad their writing is. I mean, I understand it's YouTube comment section. That's fine, but it's remarkably bad. My entire screen was red when I copy and pasted this in. In 2019, when I would go for a walk, I didn't see one Indian. Now, I see hundreds of Indians when I go for a walk. Rather, when I got for a walk. The government allows 30K, blah, blah, blah. 1 in 5 people are not ethnically Irish. Give it 5 more years, it'd be 2 in 5. Holy shit, 2 in 5, that's a lot. 40%, wow. There are cities in the UK where British people are a minority and they teach kids Islam. Whoa, wow. This is just like nonsense. He saw some Twitter headline. And also, we're talking about Ireland, and okay. But I guess, again, these people love analogical reasoning. That's reasoning by analogy, because their actual arguments never have any substance. So it's easier to just jump to some other case and say, look what happened here. That's going to happen here. It's stupid. It's lazy, but that's fine. Ah, man, it's really over for Europe. So let's do some reality checks. Ireland is 90% white. We're talking the level of white that America was for, most of its history. It is massively white. It's 2.8% Asian, 1.2% black, 0.3% Arab, 1.2% mixed, and 4.5% not stated. We can give all the not stated over to non-white. When, obviously some of it is going to be white, and still say that 90% of the population is white. So this idea that he's walking around seeing 1 million Indians everywhere, it's just not true. The vast majority of people in Ireland are still white. And when you look at the non-citizen population, which makes up about 15% of the population, nearly 50% of them are from other European countries. 13% are from the UK. The remaining 37% are not from EU or the UK, but a large portion of them are Ukrainian. 107,000 Ukrainians have been given temporary protection since 2022. So this idea that there's this massive influx of non-white people, it's simply not true. Now, you could make that case for America. Yes, we do get a lot of non-white immigration, but Ireland, it's just not the case. You are vastly white. The vast majority of the population is white, that is, and most of the immigrants coming in are white. And then the people who aren't white, well, rather, I mean, they're still white, but the people who aren't coming from the EU or the UK, a large portion of them are Ukrainians. So are you getting a decent amount of Indians? Yeah, there's a decent amount of Indians coming in, but the reality is they don't make up a majority or a plurality of either the immigrants or the non-citizen population that is living there. So that's a fantasy. You're living in a fantasy world. And a lot of these people's ideas and notions come from these false realities that are given to them because they're too stupid to see through them. So when people tell them, oh, hey, all these non-white people are coming in, they just believe it because they're not going to go look at the data. They're not going to go look at the demographics because they're just going to contradict everything that they say. And honestly, I don't think these people could pull up this stuff if they even wanted to. Not only that, but we can look and the economic benefit is clear. It's the same thing as in America, in Ireland. You are benefiting from the immigrants. This is a quote from something that I linked here. It's a study on the immigrants that have been coming in. It says, overall, the research highlights the scale and importance of migration flows to and from Ireland, as well as the inherent dynamism of the Irish labor market. Both in an absolute sense and relative to European peers, migration flows have been substantial. It is safe to assume that the post-pandemic recovery in the economy would have stalled if it were not for inward migration. So it's the same story as America. You are benefiting from immigration. The same thing that you're complaining about is the only thing keeping you afloat. So, as I said here, the economic picture is similar to America. The demographics aren't. A lot of these people coming in are white. A lot of the non-citizen population is white, and the vast majority of Irish people are still white. The vast majority. So, the demographics aren't as scary as you make them out to be, and the economic picture is just as promising as America. So I don't know what you're complaining about. If you want to advocate for stagnation, which is what you do want to do, you want Ireland to fall back to the non-important, geopolitically irrelevant country that it once was. If you want to advocate for that, do it. But be honest. Don't pretend you're doing it for the benefit of the Irish people. No, you're not. Lastly, the average age of a white Irish person is 54 years old. That's even older than a white person in America. So let's be clear. If you want to advocate for the continuation of the Irish people as a purely white nation, you are advocating for the stagnation and decline of that country because you are advocating for the average person to be 54 years old. So, that's fine if you want that. But again, the immigration argument is just as easy here as it is in America. It may be even easier because you're wrong about the demographics. But yeah, so that's the first argument, just completely destroyed, just nonsensical. This one is the second argument, and it's way longer. This guy, he talks about brevity is the soul of wit and then writes an entire essay in my comment section. But let's go through it. He said, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to kind of skip through. I highlighted like the main stuff. Don't feel you addressed Hyde's views honestly here, although he lacks self-articulation, so even the Hyde fans realize how stupid he is. It's clear what he's trying to communicate. Much of your video was vague and confused rambling. Yeah, I know it sounds like that if you don't understand the English language. Let's see. As if ethnocentric views and skepticism of Jewish/Zionist influence in the government media aren't well-defined viewpoints in today's political discussion. So as I say here, these views are not well-defined, and they're certainly not well-defended. I had to add in well-defended, by the way, because he said well-defined. Like, we could suppose that they're well-defined. That wouldn't make them good arguments. Obviously, he thinks they're good arguments. So this guy can't even defend his own defense of the views that he's putting forward. Like, that is just remarkably embarrassing. But okay. Where are the defenders of ethnocentric views that put forth a coherent defense? Because I'll make a video on them tomorrow, and I won't even need to prepare. No one can put forth a coherent defense. Probably the best person to do it would have been someone like Spencer, given that he was the founder of the alt-right and that he conceptualized a lot of this stuff, and that he has a high degree of education from prominent institutions, and he's read a lot. And I destroyed his views the other day in a video. I exposed them as literally illogical, as unable to instantiate themselves over a long period of time in any independent manner. So, no, they aren't well-defined. And as for Jewish/Zionist influence in the government, I mean, no one's going to disagree that Jewish Americans have influence in America. Obviously, they do. They're a very successful subgroup of the American population that does tend to be somewhat tribalistic, and as such, in this political system, which is defined by competing interest groups, they do have a lot of influence, obviously. But how does that lead to any, like, what do you want me to conclude from that? That's a natural consequence of the system that we've set up. They don't have complete control. It's not, anything inherent to them as a people. So, I mean, what are you wanting me to say about that? Put forth a more coherent and stronger position, and then I can engage with it. But if you're just going to say, Jewish people have influence, I'm going to say, of course, they're 25% of the Ivy League student bodies. They make, obviously, they have, higher IQs as documented by nearly every study that's ever been published. They have in-group preference that exceeds that of the native population. They are, prior to 1948, they were a diasporic people. And so, again, tribalism arises. So, yes, of course they're influential. What are you concluding from this? So, you make an argument. He says no clear counter-arguments because there's no clear argument. Like, what are you putting forward in this latter half? The ethnocentrism is easy because that is a clear proposition. Jewish/Zionist influence? Yeah, I mean, it exists. So does African-American lobbying. Plenty of other interest groups exist. Like, what? Okay. Furthermore, having little historical knowledge and little understanding of geopolitical events, look how vague that is, by the way, which part of history, which geopolitical event, like, your lack of specificity goes to show how stupid you are, which you openly admit to in this video, makes it hard to take you seriously. And here I put low VCI, verbal comprehension index, because this guy says that I admit that I have little understanding of history or geopolitical events. No, I don't. Like, you're just an idiot. I said that I don't have an opinion on the morality of the situation, specifically with regard to, Palestine and Israel. I said that I don't have some strong moral stance. That doesn't mean that I don't know what's happening over there. I have moral stances with regard to particular things that happen, like the blocking of supplies going into Gaza. That is wrong. But if you're going to ask me who is right overall in the conflict between, the Palestinians or the Israelis, I don't know. Because I have a more power-centric view of the world. And, the reality is the Israelis did go in there and conquer a land. And so should they give that back? I don't know. I'd probably not. But does that mean they're justified in the things they're doing? No. But then this makes this a morally confusing situation. As someone who's not philosophically inept, I look at the situation and say it's unclear. Now, there are particular events that I can condemn. For example, we should not have aided Israel in their campaign against Iran, as we have done so now. And so if you want to ask me about particular things, I can give you an opinion. But if you're going to ask me overall who is right morally, I'm going to look at you like the idiot that you are and say that it's a little bit more philosophically complicated than you want to make it seem. So just low VCI on display. And then he said, saying that the Great Replacement isn't happening because it's not maliciously orchestrated intentionally misses the point. No, it doesn't. That's the definition of the Great Replacement. I have a quote here. The Great Replacement theory, in simple terms, states that welcoming immigration policies, particularly those impacting non-white immigrants, are part of a plot designed to undermine or replace the political power and culture of white people living in Western countries. That is the Great Replacement theory, not the idea that demographic shifts are happening. And newsflash, retard, demographic shifts always happen. Forever and always. It is a permanent feature of things because things exist in a state of flux. There is no static culture or people that has ever existed or will ever exist because things change. So yes, demographic changes are happening, shifts are happening, but the Great Replacement theory doesn't say that. It says that it's an orchestrated plot. You're not going to shift the, you're not going to pull this Mott and Bailey fallacy. You're not going to shift the argument, from one easy claim to some indefensible claim. Or sorry, from some indefensible claim to an easy claim, which is what you're trying to do when you say the Great Replacement and then you tell me demographic shifts are happening. Yeah, idiot, I can read data. And so he says, let's see, I don't think there's anything important in here. It is happening, blah, blah, blah. And then he explains how demographic shifts occur. Like, are you an idiot? Everyone knows how they occur. Yes, there is a low birth rate. And as such, we're bringing in workers because we need to, or else we will stagnate and decline like Japan did. No shit. Like, what are you talking about? He says, if you support white erasure or simply don't care, then argue for that. Don't pretend it isn't happening. Where have I pretended it isn't happening? Again, this guy is seeing things that don't exist. And that's just a pattern with these people. You know, they think everyone's Jewish, which I'll get into. They think I'm Jewish. They think that, there's all this control that's happening. They think that the Great Replacement theory is happening. You are seeing things that don't exist. You need to be medicated, genuinely. Because I never said I'm not going to say white erasure. That's a loaded term. Erasure implies intent. It's not intentional. Again, he's trying to shift between two definitions of the Great Replacement. Pick one, retard. Either it's an inevitable or unintentional force of nature, or it's intentional. Pick one. So I don't support white erasure. I don't even support. I just acknowledge natural trends that occur. Obviously, yes, white people are declining as a natural consequence of a low birth rate and a desire to maintain the country as it is. So that's what I say. I say, where is it? I say, I can't find it. Oh, I said, I support the continuation of the country. Simple. That's what I support. I don't support white erasure. I support the continuation of the country, which requires bringing in people. And guess what? There's not a lot of white people really anywhere. So, I mean, if you want it to be white people, then start having kids. The fuck? Let's see. What else? Again, and anyone who wants to argue that there's no evidence for the Great Replacement theory as it is defined, which, by the way, I give you the definition. Why? Because there's a clear economic benefit, and there's clear consequences to avoidance. The clear economic benefit to immigration has been demonstrated in Ireland, and it could easily be demonstrated in America. I'll make a video on that if you're too stupid to understand that immigration is obviously economically beneficial. Also, there are clear consequences to avoiding immigration. As demonstrated here when we look at Japan, the Japanese people have an average IQ that eclipses that of Americans by probably like 5 points on average, and yet they have failed. Why? Because they refused to open up in the manner that we did. And now they're trying to, but it's probably too late. They are no longer the power in Asia, and they haven't been for a long time. You can see that since the 90s, they just haven't grown, and this is horrible. And now they have an inverted population pyramid, and their people are going to suffer drastically as a consequence of their illogical tribalism. I don't know what they're going to do. It's worrying. But that is what happens whenever you pursue these kinds of illogical policies that people like, this guy want to pursue. And so because it is so logical to accept immigration abductively, in other words, inference to the best explanation, tells us that this policy direction has been accepted for reasons that are different from the Great Replacement. In other words, the Great Replacement isn't true. Simple abductive argument. Finally, he says, additionally, the West, specifically Athens, invented democracy in the formal institutional sense. This is just, it's stupid. I'm going to stop saying that word. I don't know if I can say that on YouTube. I'll have to look at the policies. But I said, additionally, so I quoted him, additionally, the West invented democracy in the formal institutional sense. This is just stupid because it pretends that there is one notion of democracy. Like, it's clear you've just never read any political theory. If you go to someone like Sheldon Wallen, he's going to tell you that democracy is an ephemeral, evanescent kind of event. Sorry, my phone went off. He's going to say that it arises spontaneously and that it leaves almost as soon as it came. And that democracy cannot be formalized because the formalization of democracy renders it manipulable and contradicts the very nature of democracy. He says that democracy entails sacrifice on the part of the demos, who themselves cannot be professional politicians, and so they must sacrifice to participate, and as such, it can't last forever. It's a sort of spontaneous event which occurs to shift the balance of power in such a way as to affect some end that the demos, the people, want. And so that right there is a very coherent notion of democracy, espoused by one of the greatest theorists on democracy that's ever lived, and it's completely different from any formalized democracy. Secondly, the formal democracy that we have is one in which we have engraft representation onto democracy as a means to, by the way, limit the very thing that democracy sets out to do, which is give power to the people. And so it's completely different from the Greek sense of democracy. And the founders knew this too. They didn't like the Greek sense of democracy. If you've read Aristotle, you understand that democracy was actually the corrupted form of one of the major political typologies. It's sort of mob rule. And as such, political theorists throughout the ages have been skeptical of democracy in all forms. Now, our form of democracy has become, as Wallen points out, basically a myth that supports the actual non-democratic structures that exist in our society today. So this guy knows nothing about democracy. Secondly, if you're going to talk about... So the reason why that comment is stupid is because there is no formal institutional sense of democracy, right? You're trying to invent something where it doesn't exist. Democracy is protean. It exists in many forms, and it comes about, in varying times and varying ways. So you can't describe one form to it. Secondly, the idea that sort of the genesis of democracy existed in Greece is also wrong. Many historians say now that actually democracy was probably borrowed from a sort of primordial form that existed in the Near East. Here's an abstract. Was democracy invented by the Greeks to replace the anarchy and imperial rule characteristic of earlier Near Eastern societies? Although what was explicitly borrowed from antiquity by modern political thinkers looks Athenian, there was democracy before the polis. Egyptian and Mesopotamian politics relied on public debate and detailed voting procedures. Countless assemblies convened at the thresholds of public buildings or city gates. Disputed trials were submitted to superior courts. Countervailing powers reminded leaders that justice was their responsibility. This was not full democracy, but the Greek version was not perfect either. And I have a quote from Sheldon Wallen to support that idea that Greek democracy was limited. Athenian democracy was not, as modern democracies claim to be, inclusive. Women, minors, slaves, and resident aliens were excluded. So you just don't understand democracy. You don't understand political theory. You're historically ignorant. So just don't speak on stuff like that, because it's clear whenever you say this stuff that you've never read any high-level political theory. You've never engaged with democratic theory, and you don't know what you're talking about. Finally, he says, Great Britain, the nation you claim to be a tyrannical oppressor of the American people, was one of the most democratic nations on earth at the time and played a vital role in spreading blah, blah, blah. And that's just laughable. America was far more democratic in its early years after the Revolution and even during the Revolution than Britain was. If you read de Tocqueville, if you read Democracy in America, you understand that they actually argue that democracy in America is unique and it is stronger than anything that has really ever arisen elsewhere as a consequence of the sort of leveling that was concomitant with the introduction of these peoples into what, Roosevelt would call the untamed wilderness in his Man in the Arena speech. In other words, people became equalized by necessity as a result of this sort of step away from civilization and into barbarism. It's funny, I actually heard, I think it was Richard Spencer make this point where he said that there was a sort of regression that occurred where, the American peoples took a step back, civilizationally speaking. And as such, there was this land of opportunity. And it was there was this insatiable thirst for acquisition. And so these sort of features of early America led to a novel democracy, which was far more democratic than something like Britain, which heavily circumscribed who could vote. And so the idea that the demos were represented in Great Britain during the time of the American Revolution is simply laughable. Not only that, but obviously the American peoples didn't view it that way because they were excluded from the base of people who made the decisions. That was the entire point of the American Revolution. And so Britain not only circumscribed who could vote vis-a-vis the British people themselves, but they circumscribed who could vote vis-a-vis their colonies. So it wasn't some democratic institution, it was an empire. Just stop saying this stupid stuff because it's obvious you are ignorant. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but you clearly have no understanding of the things that you're speaking about, and you're just as dumb as Sam Hyde is. That's why it's so easy to combat these stupid ideas. So that's that argument. And now I'll just end by saying this. There are delusions that exist within these people's minds. This happened on Twitter. Now it's happening on YouTube. I'm being accused of being Jewish. Why? Because I disagree with you. If I were Jewish, I would tell you. Why? Because then I could brag about the irony that exists where you guys look at, black people and say, we have higher IQs. That explains why we're so good and you're so not good with regard to these success metrics. And then you look at Jews who are more successful than you and you say, well, that can't be because of IQ. I would laugh in your face about these ironies. And I would ironically play up some notion of, you like to act like you're so good. Well, we're better than you. I would do that because that's hilarious. And it goes to show how stupid and two-faced your sort of ideology is, where on the one hand you want to say, these objective metrics matter, and then on the other hand, when they don't favor you, you want to abandon them. So no, I'm not Jewish, but if I were, trust me, I'd be laughing in your face about it because it makes you look stupid whenever you use all these metrics that you lose out on to justify your relative superiority with regard to these metrics with regard to black people or Hispanic people. So no, I'm not Jewish, but I would tell you if I was. Let's see. Finally, comedian. This is another one of the defenses that these retards level. They say, he's a comedian. He's often playing characters. I don't think he's being serious. Sam Hyde is an entertainer. You could take everything he says with a grain of salt. Here's why this doesn't work. Being a comedian doesn't allow you to say retarded shit and present it as true. That's one. And two, low IQ Hyde fans actually believe the things that he says. Right here in this comment, this guy said, with that said, he's got an interesting point, and I think he's onto something. So you idiots latch onto the things that he says, even though they're stupid, even though they're unsubstantiated, even though random people like me on the internet can disprove them easily by reading 1 or 2 books. You latch onto it as though it's true. So no, this comedian defense doesn't work. Okay, I don't care if he's a comedian. He's not going to sit here and say stupid stuff and get away with it. Finally, one of the defenses was, or not really defenses, but one of the last grabs to defend him, rather, was he's super intelligent, I promise. Everyone was saying, even if you disagree with him, you have to admit he's smart. No, I don't have to admit he's smart. He comes off as an idiot, and he lost a debate to a guy who was completely unprepared, who has no knowledge of the political domain, because Sam Hyde can't defend the things that he's saying. He gets these notions from people like Fuentes or other people on the far right, and he parrots them. But he can't defend them because they are indefensible. And the people who actually could maybe put forth somewhat of a coherent defense are actually doing political shows. They are actually knowledgeable in the things that they discuss. Sam Hyde is not one of them. And that unwillingness to entertain domains of knowledge, to step outside of the bounds of the things that you know, is indicative of someone who not only lacks epistemological rigor, but lacks the intellectual capacity to understand the erroneous nature of the moves that they're making. So no, he's not smart. He got completely destroyed in that debate. You're coping. And that's that. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my YouTube, check out my Substack, and so on and so forth. Leave a like, leave a comment, leave a dislike. I don't really care. It's all engagement, and it boosts me in the algorithm. See you later.